Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alhamdulillah. Wa salatu wa salamu ala Sayyidina Rasulillah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa man wala. Welcome back, everyone, to lecture 11. We're going to stick with Surah Al-Takwir and the tafsir of Al-Alusi. I'm actually going to I decided to pick up where I left off because there are some interesting discussions. We'll read verse 6, 7, 8, and 9. The main discussion point is going to be about the verse 7, when the souls alike are joined with like. So he has an interesting commentary about the pairing of the souls in the resurrection. And this segues into a larger principle that we've talked about before, or maybe I didn't talk about it in the tafsir. I've talked about it before in my lectures, about one of the themes of the Quran is the takamul, the mutual completion of one of another. So the fact that Allah Ta'ala has created everything in pairs means that they complete one another. So this tafsir kind of segues into that bigger principle, and I think that's important. But really the bulk of what we're going to talk about is the next set of verses 8 and 9 about the infant girls who are buried alive. Of course, a very horrible jahili practice. He has a standard tafsir in the beginning to talk about that. But then he starts to sort of go off on a couple of tangents which are important. And then he talks about what is the status of those children that were buried alive in the hereafter. And then that segues into a larger conversation, which is an aqidah issue of what happens to the children of the non-believers when they die in the hereafter. And there's a lot of discussion, and he kind of breaks down the madhahib, and he has some interesting people that he quotes from. He quotes from Ahmed Sirhindi, he quotes from Ibn Taymiyyah, he quotes from Jalal al-Suyuti. I mean, it's a whole gambit of opinions that I think is really worth us spending some time looking at, because it shows the encyclopedic nature of Al-Alusi, and it kind of follows the protocols that we talked about in the last class, where he'll list everything and he'll kind of give what he thinks is the strongest opinion, but he doesn't shy away from those type of discussions. So I think those are the main points we'll talk about, and hopefully inshallah will be interesting. We'll begin in the next clip, inshallah. Okay, so Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Verse 6, وَإِذَا الْبِحَارُ سُجِّرَتْ, and when the seas are stoked, roaring fire. So this is a very small part of the tafsir, but he says that the seas will all merge into one, the salt water and the sweet water, and it will serve as like a bed of fire, and it will serve as a bed of fire that will fuel the hellfire. And in after those two sentences, he says, وَلَيْسَ لَهُ مُسْتَنِدْ أَثَرْ عَنِ السَّلَفِ, and these two sentiments about him describing it does not have a direct tradition that goes back to the Salaf to support it. And then he just keeps going. Right, and that's okay. What he's saying is that's okay. It doesn't have to be that there's every single sentiment of tafsir has a actual hadith that talks about it. He says, that's what people have said in the past, that one of the meanings of the verse is that. So when we find something like that, it means a couple of things. It means, first of all, he could be wrong. He could have just not found it. And maybe if we kept searching and you spent a month just on this topic, maybe you'll find in some of the masanid and some of the books of hadith traditions, even if they're super weak or maybe even forged or false or whatever, but you might find something. So that's one possibility. He just didn't find anything. Another possibility is that, as he said, like those details about fueling the hellfire, it's just sort of some kind of statement that was passed on, but you can trace that statement back to an earlier authority, a great scholar from the Salaf period that said that, based on some of the hadith in which he deduced from it that conclusion. That could be another conclusion. A third possibility is it's just sort of inherited wisdom that we might not necessarily know where it's from, and it's just generally accepted because what he just mentioned actually is just restating in our language what the verse is saying with a little bit extra details, and it's a logical conclusion. So those are some of the possibilities, and stuff like that appears all the time. The reason I'm spending so much time on something that's so small, well, it's not so small, but on this point, is I want you to understand the different approaches to tafsir. So the point of this course is not to give you point by point, tafsir of Juz Amma, as I said multiple times, but to give you a flavor, a tasting of the different approaches to tafsir and how vast it is, and how we can accept a lot more than we might usually think we can accept vis-a-vis interpretations. The things that we accept, though, on the top of that pyramid, they're going to be other verses from the Quran and sound hadith. It goes without, because we're Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah. It goes without saying. That's obviously the top of the list. But then if you keep going down the list, some of the things that I just mentioned are acceptable as well. But they're just not going to be as strong, and it means that they could be supplanted if we do some further investigation. Okay, so that was verse 6. Now verse 7, وَإِذَا النُّفُوسُ زُوِّجَتْ, and when the souls alike are joined with like. So he mentions some hadith narrated by Al-Hakim, who graded it as sound on the authority of Nu'man ibn Bashir, famous Sahabi radiallahu anhu, and also Sayyidina Umar radiallahu anhu, that the Prophet ﷺ, that Umar radiallahu anhu was asked about this, and he said, يقرن الرجل الصالح مع الرجل الصالح في الجنة ويقرن الرجل السوء مع الرجل السوء في النار فذلك تزويج الأنفس. So he said that the good man, a good person, will be paired with a good person in paradise. A bad man will be paired with a bad person in the hellfire. And then he says وقال بعض, and then Lucy saying some people say this is that there will be layers. The prophets will be paired with prophets, the saints will be paired with saints, so on and so forth. So on and so forth. Muqatil ibn Sulaiman said that the believers will be paired with their spouses, and also with their hur al-ain and others, and that the disbelievers will be paired with their shayateen, the people, the jinn, satanic forces that took them away from the straight path. Okay, and then he says something that's very important. وَالنَّفْسِ عَلَيْهِ بِمَعْنَى الرُّوحِ, and he says the nafs here in the إِذَا النُّفُوسُ زُوِّجَتْ, the nafs here meaning the soul. And this has to do with nomenclatures. When we talked about tasawwuf, I might have mentioned, or I hope I did mention, the differentiation between the nafs and the self and the soul. But sometimes they're used as one. Sorry, I misquoted. He said that the nafs is paired with its spouse in the al-ba'th, in the resurrection, and he says in this case an-nafs bima'na alayhi bima'na ruh, in this case meaning the soul is paired. So maybe this is like before the bodily resurrection. So it's important to note that sometimes the nafs means the self. In the really academic formal language of tasawwuf, when we say nafs, we mean the self, which is different than the soul, which is the ruh, which is different than the body, the jasad. The problem is because we don't know much about the ruh, sometimes the ruh is referred to as a nafs or referred to as al-qalb, the heart, and things like that. So that could be a confusing part of the discussion, whether it's in tafsir or tasawwuf or any Islamic subject. So in this case, he actually points out what he means, and I thought that was kind of interesting. Okay, now the bulk of what I want to talk about is the next set of verses. وَإِذَا الْمَوْءُودَةُ سُئِلَتْ بِأَيِّ ذَنْبٍ قُتِلَتْ, number 8 and 9. And when the infant girl buried alive is asked, and verse number 9, for what sin was she slain? Okay, so this was, to understand the verse, this was a very horrible pre-Islamic practice in the Jahili period, in which, and he narrates the stories that, a man would or families would feel like an infant girl will somehow be a shame because he didn't have a boy, or they were worried about the dismantling of inheritance if the girl was present. So, for all of these ignorant reasons, it was common that they would bury infant girls alive. And he kind of gives an elaborate scheme of that. Sometimes, if they wanted them saved, they would dress them as a boy and like send them out to to shepherd. So obviously not everybody did that, but it was enough of a practice that it's mentioned in the Quran. And then he goes through some of the different, the word al-maw'udatu. He goes through some of the different morphology, sarf, which I'm not going to do right now, because it leads to different recitations that you might find of the verse. But the main etymology is al-wa'd. The al-maw'uda comes from al-wa'd, waw, alif, with a hamza on it, dal, and huwa الثقل. It's something that is heavy. And then he says كأنها سميت بذلك لأنها تثقل بالتراب حتى تموت. He's like, as if these young girls were called that by the Quran because the earth is piled on them and becomes heavy until they're suffocated and they die. May Allah Ta'ala protect us. Okay, so he gives just sort of like a long, it's almost like a page, but everything that I just said takes about a page for him to say. And it's pretty standard in the sense that he's just explaining kind of what's going on with that. And as I mentioned, he goes into the morphology of the word. There are other morphological options of where the etymology of the word al-maw'uda. And then, as I said, it impacts some of the possible recitations. But from the point of view of impacting the meaning, none of this impacts the meaning. The meaning is what we read in the translation. Okay. And of course, بِأَيِّ ذَنْبٍ قُتِلَتْ, for what sin was I slain? Meaning that يوم القيامة, these girls will ask their parents. So it's obviously a rhetorical question, but it's this aspect, the fact that there'll be, there's life after death. That's what we believe in. That's what this surah is about. So therefore, he's going to start to postulate, well, there are all of these derivative questions that come about the children of the people that die and their stance in the hereafter. So that's kind of the bulk of what I want to talk about next. I see that I'm running out of time. And we'll just have to pick this up, inshallah, in the next clip. Bi-idhnillahi ta'ala. Okay, so part of what I wanted to say is he picks up these possible scenarios. So he says, وَاسْتَدَلَّ الزَّمَخْشَرِيُّ بِالْآيَةِ عَلَى أَنَّ أَطْفَالَ الْمُشْرِكِينَ لَا يُعَذِّبُونَ. So he said, Az-Zamakhshari, who was a very famous Mu'tazilite and master of the Arabic language, actually has a beautiful tafsir. I was going to do that tafsir, but I don't know, for some reason I just wanted to do this one instead. So I didn't do the Zamakhshari. But again, I like the fact very much. And by the way, I'm not as familiar with Al-Alusi as I am, like for example, with Al-Razi in the Tafsir. So I'm enjoying these recordings because it's getting me to read. So I'm liking very much this sort of gambit of sources and authorities, philosophy, other religions, Mu'tazilites. I like that. That kind of stuff gets me excited. So he says, as Zamakhshari, rahimahullah, he used this verse, بِأَيِّ ذَنْبٍ قُتِلَتْ, to prove and uses a proof text that the children of the disbelievers are not punished. Okay, so this is then going to begin like this sort of series of queries into this issue. And then he says, وَعَلَى أَنَّ الْعَذَابَ لَا يَسْتَحِقُّ إِلَّا بِالذَّنْبِ. And he's meaning his Zamakhshari's legal thinking or deduction is that punishment is not something that is merited except if there is a sin. Okay, so this is it might seem like a simple statement, but this is a big statement, because then, okay, if punishment is not warranted except if there's a sin, well, what happens about children that die that are not sin, but they're not children of the believers? This is sort of, he's kind of, in a logical progression, this is where he's going to go. And that's what Zamakhshari said is a very valid, obviously, position. I mean, that makes a lot of sense. And when hopefully I'll do a good job, but when we come full circle, that's basically what we're going to say. Um, okay, there's just a lot of other stuff. I don't want to get into all that other stuff. Okay. So now he's going to pick up this discussion, this wider discussion about children. He says that Imam al-Nawawi, well, first of all, he says that Imam al-Laqani, the Sahib al-Jawhara, the author of the Jawhara poem, which we study in theology, says that children of non-believers and their status in the hereafter is a issue of dispute. So he says, now Alusi picks up the discussion. So An-Nawawi says, rahimahullah, in Sharh Muslim, and Nawawi's commentary on Muslim for us as Shafi'is is a very important resource, and it comes up a lot actually. And it's interesting that, I mean, I would almost say it's 50-50. Nawawi's legal writings like the Minhaj and the Majmu'ah and Rawdat al-Talibin, like the three main books of fiqh that he has, they come up, but also, I say an equal amount, also his commentary on Sahih Muslim. So just something as a Shafi'i to know that we should spend more time. I need to spend more time consulting that when we're looking up things. Anyway, so he says, and Nawawi says, rahimahullah, in his commentary on Muslim, أجمع من يعتد به من علماء المسلمين على أن من مات من أطفال المسلمين فهو من أهل الجنة. So he says, and this phraseology is very important because it's very common, and it's a phraseology that we still use today. It is an issue of consensus amongst those whose knowledge is considered. So, meaning there might be other people that will disagree with what we're saying, but those people's opinions don't count towards consensus. And that's very, very important because we understand when we studied Usul al-Fiqh that ijma', consensus, is only the consensus of the mujtahids amongst the fuqaha. Other people might have dissenting opinions, but with all respect, when it comes to matters of consensus, anybody who's not a mujtahid's opinion doesn't count towards that consensus. This is a very important thing to highlight because in the age in which we live in, because of the power of social media and communications, and we have like this democratization of opinions and ideas, and therefore we feel, well, a lot of people disagree. Well, it doesn't matter what a lot of people say, even if 100,000 people. We're talking about what the mujtahids say. When the mujtahid is brought forth and their opinion is the one that counts towards these type of issues. It's not an issue of we're going to take a vote or take a survey or something like that. So he says it is an opinion. It's a point of consensus amongst those whose knowledge is considered that whoever dies from the children of the Muslims is from the people of paradise. So the idea is if you're a family, if you're a husband and wife and you have a child, and God forbid, may Allah Ta'ala protect us, that child dies in infancy or young age, he's saying it's a point of ijma' that child is in the paradise. لأنه ليس مكلفا, because that child is not morally responsible, does not have taklif. Now that's obviously going to open up another, well, what happens if they're not Muslim? The child also doesn't have taklif. So just keep that in the back of your mind. And then he says, how some people whose knowledge and opinion doesn't count argued against this because of the hadith of Sayyidah Aisha radiallahu anha, that a young boy died from the Ansar. So she said, "Tuba lahu asfurun min asafir al-jannah, lam ya'mal su'a wa lam yudrik." She said, glad tidings to them. He's a bird from the birds of paradise. He didn't even commit a sin at all. And then the Prophet ﷺ, when he heard that, he said, this is the continuation of the hadith, أو غير ذلك يا عائشة إن الله تعالى خلق للجنة أهلا خلقهم لها وهم في الأصلاب آبائهم وخلق للنار أهلا خلقهم لها وهم في أصلاب آبائهم. And the Prophet ﷺ said it could be something else, O Aisha. Allah Ta'ala created people for the paradise in the wombs of their parents, and He created people for the hellfire, for the paradise in the womb of their parents, and He created people for the hellfire in the wombs of their parents. So some people, and Nawawi is saying, whose opinion really doesn't count towards this issue, cite this hadith as a disagreement to the children. So Alusi continues, وَأَجَابَ الْعُلَمَاءُ عَنْهُ بِأَنَّهُ لَعَلَّهُ عَلَيْهِ. So he's saying this is responded to, that the Prophet ﷺ could have been teaching Sayyidah Aisha not to say anything so definite without definite proof. Or another possibility of this interpretation of this hadith is that the Prophet ﷺ said this before he was informed formally that the children of the Muslims are in paradise. Because the Prophet ﷺ said in another hadith that's sound, ما من مسلم يموت له ثلاث من الولد لم يبلغ الحنث إلا أدخله الله تعالى الجنة بفضله ورحمته إياهم وغير ذلك من الحديث. So the Prophet ﷺ said elsewhere that no Muslim who has 3 children that die except that those that haven't reached puberty, that those children will be the cause of that parent into the paradise. And then Alusi says, and there are many other hadith. So here we have an interesting legal discussion, or an interesting discussion, in which now we're saying, look, at the end of the day, all people who count, whose opinion counts, is a point of consensus. So if I was to ask you, what is the ruling in Islam of the children of the Muslims that die in infancy? We say, by consensus, by ijma', they're in the paradise. And then somebody might say, oh, but I read in this book, or I read in that book something else because of this hadith. Okay, we still have a response to that, even though that doesn't break the consensus. And the response is, as he said, either the Prophet ﷺ was teaching Sayyidah Aisha something about not speaking in broad proclamations without definite proof, or we also have these other hadiths, which means that it could have been something that was abrogated. Okay, so that part of the conversation I just wanted to read for you because I think it's very important. I think it's very interesting how he's talking about these. And then now we turn to the وَأَمَّا أَطْفَالَ الْمُشْرِكِينَ. How about the children of the disbelievers? So he says, فِيهِمْ ثَلَاثَةُ مَذَاهِبْ. There are 3 opinions about this. Going back to what Al-Laqani said, in a couple of paragraphs ago. Obviously, I'm running out of time, but let me see how far I can get. So, a large part of opinion, a large opinion, قال الأكثر, many of them say, هم في النار تبعا لآبائهم. Many people say they are in the hellfire, following their parents, because of the hadith. The Prophet ﷺ was asked about children of the disbelievers who die young, and he says, Allah Ta'ala a'lam bima kanu amilin. Allah Ta'ala knows best what they have done. I'll pick this up in the next clip, inshallah. Okay, so let me just backtrack a couple of seconds. So now Al-Alusi turns to the other issue about the children of the disbelievers. And he says that there are 3 madhabs, there are 3 opinions about this. And he said the majority of people say they are in the hellfire following their parents, based on the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ that he was asked about the children of the disbelievers who die young, and he said, Allahu Ta'ala a'lam bima kanu amilin. Only Allah Ta'ala knows best what they were doing. Meaning he kind of like left it open that it's not definitive they're in paradise. A second group, توقف طائفة منهم. So a second group said, I'm not going to opine on this. I don't have an opinion on this. I'm not really sure of the answer. And then he said, وقالت الثالثة. And then the third madhab, the third group says, وهو الصحيح, and this is the correct opinion. الذي ذهب إليه المحققون. This is the opinion that those that sought to verify this issue, the muhaqqiq. And the muhaqqiquna usually, not always, but usually are later day scholars that will come after there's a debate out there in our tradition. And you know what? I'm scratching my head. No one really settled that debate. I'm actually going to dedicate 6-7 months to researching this, and I'm going to solve this debate. That's what tahqiq is. So he says this third opinion is the right one because it's what the muhaqqiquna did. أنهم من أهل الجنة, that they are from the people of paradise. ويستدل له بأشياء منها, and then we can prove this. So he doesn't just give you the opinion, the madhab, the opinion, but he's going to buttress the opinion with the proof. And he says, and we can prove this by the following. We have the hadith of Sayyidina Ibrahim alayhi salam, when he saw the Prophet alayhi salam, when the Prophet saw him in the paradise, and around him were children, the children of people. So he said, the Prophet, قال رسول الله قالوا, the Sahaba said, were they the children of the mushrikeen? And then the Prophet said, أولاد المشركين, they were the people of the mushrikeen. رواه Bukhari في صحيحه. So this is a hadith narrated by Bukhari in his Sahih. Also, another proof text is we have the verse وَمَا كُنَّا مُعَذِّبِينَ حَتَّى نَبْعَثَ رَسُولًا. This is in Isra 15. I hope that's right. Sometimes I believe that's right. This is also very important because this is the Ash'ari, the Sunni Ash'ari position that Allah Ta'ala does not punish a people, does not tax a people, does not take people to account until and unless he sends a messenger. And we call these people Ahlul Fatra, the people of the time period, meaning the people between the time of Christ alayhi salam and Sayyidina Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wasallam. Those people are saved. This is also super important because Imam al-Ghazali has a risala, a treatise on this called Faisal al-Tafriqa, I think بين الإيمان أو الإسلام والزندقة. It's translated into English by Dr. Sherman Jackson. And called the boundaries of faith, I think. Anyway, it's a very good translation. It's a very important treatise. You must read that. And maybe when we talk about this issue in theology, we can quote it. So coming back to this, so the second proof Al-Alusi is giving us is the verse وَمَا كُنَّا مُعَذِّبِينَ حَتَّى نَبْعَثَ رَسُولًا. We don't punish a people until we send them a message. So these children didn't get the message, so they're saved. And then he says, وَلَا يَتَوَجَّهْ عَلَى الْمَوْلُودِ التَّكْلِيفِ. And then the child doesn't have moral responsibility, so this child didn't reach the level of moral responsibility, of maturity rather, to be given the message to be judged of rejecting or accepting. Now he says, how about we respond to this hadith? Oh, Allah Ta'ala knows best what happens to the children of the disbelievers. He says, أنه ليس فيه تصريح بأنهم في النار. It's not a direct text that says that they're in the hellfire. And that's really, it sounds very simple, but that's a very strong response to those that detract, even though we said that those that detract, that cite that hadith, are not those that fall into the issue of necessarily of the ijma', but we're going to respond to it nonetheless. In that hadith, there's no real clear statement that those kids are in the hellfire. And then he says, وَحَقِيقَةُ اللَّفْظَ. And Alusi saying, really what the Prophet ﷺ is saying, Allah Ta'ala a'lam bima kanu ya'malun, Allah knows best what they did, meaning if they were to become mature and adults, Allah Ta'ala knows best what they would have done. Either they would have believed or they would have continued with disbelief. So I think that's a very, and then he says intaha. Actually, as a matter of fact, I think everything that I just said is from An-Nawawi's commentary on Muslim, which is, wow, mashallah, that's like almost a page and a half quote. Okay. Okay, and then he says, there actually are more opinions. So, okay, now this is Alusi commenting on An-Nawawi. He said, actually, there are others than those three madhabs. Those are just the three majority madhabs. And this is kind of also shows you the encyclopedic nature of Al-Alusi, rahimahullah. He says, some say that they are in the barzakh, between the heaven and hell, I guess, so to use a Christian term, sort of like in purgatory. I think purgatory is the right word. He said some say that they will be tested by entering the paradise, entering into the hellfire on the day of judgment. And then he says, for those who Allah Ta'ala has written felicity, they will enter paradise. For those whom He has written damnation, they will be entered into the hellfire, as comes in some of the narrations. فَلَا يُحْكَمْ عَلَى مُعَيِّنٍ مِّنْهُمْ بِجَنَّةٍ وَلَا نَارٍ. So therefore, we do not say specifically on specific people there in the hellfire or in the paradise. And he said this is what could be meant by the people that follow this opinion. Allah Ta'ala a'lam bima kanu ya'malin. Allah knows best what they did. And then he said in the opinion of Ibn Taymiyyah that this is a nice answer to this question. And then he says, and then Jalal ad-Din Suyuti says, وَهُوَ صَحِيحَ الْمُعْتَمَد. This is the right and the relied upon. So, Suyuti and Ibn Taymiyyah, kind of opposite streams of Islamic thinking, of course, about 200 plus years apart. Ibn Taymiyyah being older than before Suyuti, but still Suyuti for us, a major figure in the madhab and in Islamic history, etc., agreeing. And then he says, وَأَخْتَارَهُ, and this opinion was chosen by Imam al-Rabbani al-Faruqi al-Sirhindi, قَدَّسَ سِرَّهُ. So Ahmed Sirhindi, he says, قَدَّسَ سِرَّهُ, may Allah Ta'ala sanctify his soul, a term of great, great respect. And of course, we should respect Imam Sirhindi, radiallahu anhum. So anyway, just, is there anything else? Anyway, what I wanted to say is, I'm not going to go further, I think, but just to point out that we've read just two verses, and really those two verses are saying the same thing. It says, وَإِذَا الْمَوْءُودَةُ سُئِلَتْ بِأَيِّ ذَنْبٍ قُتِلَتْ. When the girls that are buried alive will be resurrected, and they will ask Allah subhanahu, they will ask their parents or the people that did that, by what sin did I do to deserve this? And it's just talking about the hawl of Yawm al-Qiyamah, the awesomeness and the greatness and the intensity of Yawm al-Qiyamah. May Allah Ta'ala protect us all and our families. That's enough really of the tafsir to go on, but somebody like Alusi doesn't. He's like, well, wait a second. What does that mean that they're going to be resurrected? Well, Zamakhshari says that's proof that they're not in the, children don't go into the hellfire. Okay, well, why don't children go into the hellfire? See, you keep asking why. Well, we know that the children of the believers are in the paradise. Okay, yeah, but these are the children of the disbelievers because this was in the Jahiliyyah. So how about the children of the disbelievers? So the questions, each kind of issue brings another question, and this is the usuli approach. When we say usuli Islam or the Islam of ijtihad or so on, what we're trying to teach you guys, this is the way that it's done. You just keep asking why, and then you have pages and pages and pages of kind of argumentation. And then you see how he brought in al-Laqani. So there's this issue of Aqidah. We have now this long quote from An-Nawawi in his commentary on Muslim. And then Lucy saying, actually, there's really not just three opinions. There's other opinions. Look what I found, what Ibn Taymiyyah said, and Suyuti, and Ahmed Sirhindi, so on and so forth. So it kind of shows you his approach and how he deals with an issue, not leaving anything that should be discussed. That's it for today. Wallahu ta'ala a'la wa a'lam wa sallallahu ala sayyidina Mawlana Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam tasliman kathira. Alhamdulillah, we finished today's lecture discussing a little bit more in Surah Takwir, and we read basically verses 6, 7, 8, and 9. In verse 6, we talked about وَإِذَا الْبَحَارُ سُجِّرَتْ, the oceans and the seas and all the bodies of water becoming one, and how he gave us a tafsir of what that might mean, but yet it was an unsupported tafsir in the sense that there's no direct link. And we talked a little bit about what that might mean in the tafsir, that we can accept things like that, which means maybe he didn't find a tradition, but there is one out there that we're just not aware of, we need to spend more time finding. Or it's just a scholar who interpreted a set of evidences to say that, or it's just inherited wisdom, and that's fine. And we talked. I said, I gave you this diagram of like a pyramid, and I said at the top of the pyramid of tafsir is obviously going to be the Quran, interpreting the Quran and sound hadith, and then descending order, these type of things. And then we talked about the pairing of the selves. And we talked a little bit about why that's part of a bigger principle in the Quran of takamul, that Allah Ta'ala has created everything in pairs and the pairs complete one another. And then the bulk of the lecture was spent on verse 8 and 9 about the young girls who were buried alive in the time of Jahiliyyah. And while we kind of went through the standard tafsir, which kind of makes sense, we spent a lot of time talking about the implications that the verse has vis-a-vis children of believers and children of non-Muslims or non-believers. what is their state if they die in infancy? And we went through sort of a long kind of conversation to show how he is arguing that, well, basically they're all saved, and this is the majority, or this is the correct opinion. And he walked us through how he arrived at that correct opinion by not deducing it himself, by citing major authorities, largely Imam al-Laqani and Imam al-Nawawi radiallahu anhuma, and then a lot of other kind of interesting quotes. So I like that in Alusi for you to know. I want you to know that's sort of how he approaches things, and how it's sort of a more later version of Ar-Razi. So Ar-Razi is much older, so it's a little bit more old Arabic, but this is kind of a more approachable and more sort of in line with how we think. Anyway, those are the main topics for today. One more class on Al-Alusi, and then we'll move on from there. Walhamdulillahi Rabbil Alamin.